In the humid swamplands of north-central Florida, where Spanish moss drapes ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, the Whitmore Plantation stood as a monument to antebellum prosperity. But when restoration teams arrived in 2023 to transform the crumbling estate into a heritage tourism site, they uncovered something that had been deliberately buried for over 170 years. Hidden behind false walls and beneath rotting floorboards, the evidence of systematic crimes emerged. Crimes so disturbing that local authorities had conspired to erase them from all official records. What they found wasn't just history. It was a testament to human suffering that powerful families had spent generations trying to silence. The restoration was supposed to celebrate Florida's plantation heritage, complete with guided tours and historical reenactments. Instead, it became an archaeological nightmare that exposed the darkest chapter of American slavery, one that reveals how easily truth can be buried and how persistently it fights to resurface. As workers stripped away layers of paint and plaster, they discovered encrypted journals, hidden chambers, and evidence of a breeding program so methodical and cruel that it challenged everything historians thought they knew about Florida's antebellum period. The Whitmore family hadn't just owned slaves. They had engineered a system of human livestock that operated in complete secrecy, protected by judges, politicians, and fellow plantation owners who all profited from the conspiracy of silence. This is the story of what happens when the past refuses to stay buried and when restoration becomes revelation. Chapter 1. The Restoration That Became a Revelation. 170 years after the last slave ship left Florida's shores, construction workers at the abandoned Whitmore Plantation made a discovery that would shatter the carefully constructed narrative of Southern heritage tourism. It was March 2023, and the Florida Historical Preservation Society had contracted a team to restore the crumbling antebellum mansion for public tours. What they found behind a false wall in the basement would force historians to rewrite everything they thought they knew about slavery in Florida. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here, we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what has been silenced. The Whitmore Plantation had sat abandoned since 1962, when the last descendant of the original family died without heirs. Located 30 miles west of Gainesville, the 3,200-acre estate once represented the pinnacle of Florida's sugar and cotton empire. Local tourism boards saw an opportunity to capitalize on the growing plantation tourism industry, imagining guided tours through elegant rooms filled with period furniture and romanticized stories of Southern gentility. But when restoration specialist Maria Santos began stripping paint from the mansion's basement walls, her equipment detected hollow spaces that shouldn't have existed. Behind what appeared to be solid brick, ground-penetrating radar revealed a network of hidden chambers. The initial assumption was that these were root cellars or storage spaces typical of 19th-century construction. The reality was far more sinister. The first chamber contained dozens of leather-bound ledgers, their pages filled with meticulous records written in a code that would take cryptographers months to decipher. But even before the code was broken, the implications were clear from the numerical patterns and careful documentation of dates, ages, and physical characteristics. This wasn't a typical plantation record-keeping system. It was something far more systematic and disturbing. Dr. James Whitfield, a forensic archaeologist from the University of Florida, was called in when workers discovered additional anomalies. Beneath the floorboards of what had been the overseer's quarters, they found metal restraints built directly into the wooden beams, restraints that showed evidence of prolonged use and desperate attempts at escape. The wood around these fixtures was stained dark with what laboratory analysis would later confirm as human blood. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came when workers opened the final hidden chamber. Inside, carefully preserved by the cool, dry conditions, were detailed anatomical drawings and medical instruments that had no place in a typical plantation infirmary. The drawings depicted human subjects with clinical precision, noting breeding compatibility, genetic traits, and physical attributes with the cold methodology of livestock management. These weren't medical records. They were breeding charts for human beings. As word of the discoveries spread through archaeological circles, it became clear that the Whitmore plantation represented something unprecedented in the historical record. This wasn't just another example of plantation cruelty. It was evidence of a systematic program designed to treat enslaved people as breeding stock, complete with scientific methodology and detailed documentation that had somehow survived when all other evidence had been systematically destroyed. Local officials immediately moved to classify the findings as part of an ongoing investigation, but photos and preliminary reports had already begun circulating among researchers. The Florida Historical Preservation Society found itself facing a dilemma that went to the heart of heritage tourism. How do you turn a site of systematic human breeding into a tourist attraction? The answer, as they would soon discover, was that some histories are too dark to be packaged for public consumption. The restoration that was supposed to celebrate Florida's plantation heritage had instead uncovered its most shameful secret, one that powerful families had spent 170 years trying to keep buried. Chapter 2. The Whitmore Dynasty and the Science of Human Breeding. The encrypted ledgers found in the Whitmore plantation's hidden chambers told a story that began in 1847, when Dr. Cornelius Whitmore arrived in Florida from Virginia with ambitions that extended far beyond typical plantation agriculture. Unlike other plantation owners who viewed enslaved people as labor resources, Whitmore saw them as raw material for what he called human livestock improvement, a systematic breeding program that would revolutionize the domestic slave trade. Dr. Whitmore held a medical degree from the University of Virginia and had spent years studying animal husbandry techniques used by horse breeders in Kentucky. His private correspondence, discovered sealed in waterproof containers beneath the plantation house, revealed his belief that the same scientific principles could be applied to enslaved populations to produce what he termed premium stock for the expanding Southern economy. The Whitmore family's wealth didn't come from cotton or sugar alone. According to the decoded ledgers, they operated what amounted to a human breeding facility that supplied enslaved people to plantations across Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. The records show systematic tracking of bloodlines, careful monitoring of reproductive cycles, and detailed notes on the physical and mental characteristics of both parents and offspring. What made the Whitmore operation unique was its scientific approach. While other plantations engaged in forced breeding as a secondary source of income, the Whitmores made it their primary business model. Dr. Whitmore maintained detailed charts showing genetic lineages stretching back 3 generations, with notes on everything from physical strength and disease resistance to temperament and intelligence. These records were kept in a cipher that combined medical Latin with a numerical code of his own design. The breeding program operated under the cover of a standard agricultural plantation. To outside observers, the Whitmore estate appeared to be a typical sugar operation worked by approximately 200 enslaved people. But the hidden chambers revealed the true scope of the enterprise. At any given time, between 80 and 100 women of childbearing age were kept in what Whitmore called productive rotation, with their pregnancies and births carefully scheduled and monitored. The medical instruments found in the secret chambers included examination tables, restraints, and surgical tools that were used to ensure successful breeding outcomes. Dr. Whitmore's notes describe procedures designed to maximize conception rates and prevent miscarriages, treating enslaved women with the same clinical detachment that modern veterinarians might show toward prize livestock. The human cost of these experiments is documented in mortality records that show a death rate among pregnant women nearly 3 times higher than typical plantation averages. But the Whitmore breeding program couldn't have operated in isolation. The decoded correspondence reveals a network of buyers, sellers, and medical collaborators that extended across the South. Letters from plantation owners in other states show they were paying premium prices for Whitmore stock, often requesting specific combinations of physical traits and abilities. One letter from a Georgia cotton planter specifically requests breeding pairs with demonstrated field endurance and docile temperament. The success of the program depended on absolute secrecy. Dr. Whitmore's correspondence shows he was acutely aware that public knowledge of his methods would create scandal, even in a society that accepted slavery. His letters refer to the need for discretion in all commercial arrangements and careful management of local authorities to ensure continued operations. This careful management included regular payments to county officials, judges, and law enforcement officers who ensured that no questions were asked about the unusually high birth rates at the plantation or the constant stream of buyers who visited to inspect potential purchases. The financial records show that bribes and political contributions represented nearly 15% of the plantation's operating expenses, a significant investment in maintaining silence. The Whitmore dynasty's human breeding operation represented slavery at its most systematically cruel, the reduction of human beings to genetic resources managed with scientific precision for maximum profit. Chapter 3. The Women Who Disappeared from History. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. The most haunting discovery in the Whitmore plantation's hidden archives wasn't the medical instruments or the breeding charts. It was the meticulous record of names that had been systematically erased from all official documents. In a leather-bound journal marked Special Inventory, Dr. Cornelius Whitmore maintained a parallel record-keeping system that tracked the women who formed the core of his breeding program, complete with detailed personal histories that reveal the human cost of his scientific approach to slavery. The names in this secret ledger: Celia, age 16, acquired from Charleston estate sale for breeding potential; Dinah, age 19, proven fertility, second pregnancy proceeding normally; Sarah, age 22, requires additional medical intervention to maintain productivity, represent women who vanished from official plantation records after being designated for the breeding program. These women existed in a shadow system that operated parallel to the regular plantation operations, hidden from visitors, government inspectors, and even other enslaved people on the estate. According to the decoded entries, women selected for the breeding program were housed in separate quarters located in what appeared to be a tobacco drying barn, but was actually a carefully designed facility with hidden chambers and medical examination rooms. The women lived in a state of complete isolation, with their movements restricted and their contact with other enslaved people strictly limited. Dr. Whitmore's notes suggest this isolation was both for secrecy and what he called controlled environmental factors that would optimize breeding outcomes. The medical records reveal the systematic nature of the abuse these women endured. Each woman's reproductive cycle was tracked with clinical precision, with forced examinations conducted monthly to monitor health and fertility status. Dr. Whitmore's notes describe procedures designed to maximize conception rates, including dietary supplements, forced exercise regimens, and medical interventions that treated pregnancy as a manufacturing process rather than a human experience. But the records also reveal acts of resistance that Dr. Whitmore clearly didn't anticipate. Several entries describe women who refused cooperation with breeding protocols, or who engaged in deliberate interference with pregnancy maintenance. Well, these clinical terms obscure the reality that enslaved women found ways to resist the system even under the most controlled conditions, sometimes at the cost of their own lives. One of the most detailed case studies involves a woman identified only as Subject 47, who appears throughout 3 years of records. The entries trace her progression through multiple pregnancies, noting her exceptional genetic profile and high success rate in producing viable offspring. But between the clinical observations, a more human story emerges. This was a woman who maintained her dignity and identity even under the most dehumanizing conditions. Someone who found small ways to assert her humanity that Dr. Whitmore noted with frustration, but couldn't eliminate. The fate of these women becomes clear in the later records. As the breeding program evolved, Dr. Whitmore began selling women, along with their children, to buyers who requested complete family units. But the correspondence reveals that many of these sales were actually transfers to other plantations operating similar programs, creating a regional network of breeding facilities that shared genetic information and coordinated their operations to avoid inbreeding. The most disturbing discovery was a collection of daguerreotype photographs hidden behind a false panel in Dr. Whitmore's private study. These images, taken for what appear to be medical documentation purposes, show women and children with identification numbers, but no names. The photographs were clearly intended as a visual catalogue for potential buyers, reducing human beings to commercial specimens displayed for evaluation. Archaeological evidence from the plantation grounds suggests that not all women survived the breeding program. Ground-penetrating radar has identified burial sites that don't appear in any official cemetery records, located in remote areas of the plantation property. Preliminary excavations have revealed remains that show evidence of death during childbirth, along with burial practices that suggest these deaths were hidden from the general plantation population. The women of the Whitmore breeding program represent a deliberate erasure from historical memory. Human beings reduced to numbers in secret ledgers, while their names, their stories, and their suffering were systematically removed from any record that might survive to tell their tale. Chapter 4. The Network. How silence became systemic. The Whitmore plantation couldn't have operated its human breeding program for over a decade without a sophisticated network of collaborators, buyers, and officials who ensured that no questions were asked and no records were kept. The correspondence discovered in the hidden chambers reveals a conspiracy that extended far beyond a single Florida plantation, encompassing politicians, judges, doctors, and fellow plantation owners across the Deep South who all profited from what they euphemistically called specialized agricultural practices. The network operated through carefully coded language and financial arrangements that provided plausible deniability for all participants. Dr. Whitmore's letters refer to enslaved people as agricultural specimens, pregnancies as production cycles, and forced breeding as genetic improvement programs. This clinical terminology allowed participants to discuss the systematic rape and exploitation of enslaved women in terms that distanced them from the human reality of their actions. Central to the network's operations was Judge Harrison Caldwell of the Fifth Judicial Circuit, whose private correspondence shows he received regular payments from Dr. Whitmore in exchange for legal protection. Judge Caldwell ensured that any complaints or investigations related to the plantation were dismissed or redirected, and his court records show a suspicious absence of any legal proceedings involving the Whitmore estate, despite its large enslaved population and high mortality rates. The financial arrangements extended beyond simple bribery. The decoded ledgers reveal that Judge Caldwell was a silent partner in the breeding program, receiving a percentage of profits from sales of enslaved people to other states. His legal expertise helped establish the contracts and documentation that made these sales appear legitimate while obscuring their true nature. The judge's personal financial records, discovered in his family's estate papers, show unexplained income that coincides exactly with the Whitmore Plantation's breeding program timeline. Dr. Marcus Thurmond, the county's only licensed physician, provided medical legitimacy to the breeding program while ensuring that deaths and complications were never officially reported. His medical journals, found in the basement of his former clinic, describe procedures and treatments that were clearly related to forced breeding operations. Dr. Thurman's notes reveal that he performed examinations and procedures at multiple plantations in the region, suggesting that the Whitmore operation was part of a broader regional system. The network's reach extended to state-level politics through Senator William Hartwell, whose plantation in neighboring Georgia operated a similar breeding program. The correspondence between Dr. Whitmore and Senator Hartwell reveals coordination of breeding schedules, exchange of genetic information, and collaborative pricing strategies that created a regional monopoly on what they called premium breeding stock. Senator Hartwell used his political influence to ensure that any legislation that might interfere with plantation operations was blocked or modified. But the network's most crucial component was its system of buyers and distributors who created the market for enslaved people produced through forced breeding. The customer lists found in the hidden chambers include plantation owners from Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and South Carolina who paid premium prices for enslaved people with documented genetic lineages and specific physical traits. These buyers weren't passive participants. They actively collaborated in the breeding program by providing detailed specifications for the characteristics they desired. The correspondence reveals that buyers would often place advance orders for children who hadn't yet been born, with payments made in installments as pregnancies progressed. One particularly disturbing letter from a Louisiana sugar planter requests 6 breeding pairs ages 16 to 20 with demonstrated field endurance and proven fertility, delivery by spring planting season. The casual tone of these requests demonstrates how completely the participants had dehumanized the people they were buying and selling. The network maintained its secrecy through a combination of mutual financial interest and shared vulnerability. Each participant possessed information that could destroy the others if revealed, creating a system of enforced silence that lasted long after slavery was abolished. The discovery of identical coding systems and record-keeping methods at other plantation sites suggests that this network provided training and standardization that made the breeding operations more efficient and profitable. Bank records from the period show that the network generated enormous profits that were invested in legitimate businesses and political campaigns, allowing participants to use their criminal enterprises to build respectable public reputations. The wealth generated by systematic human trafficking and forced breeding became the foundation for several prominent Southern families whose descendants continue to benefit from these crimes today. The Whitmore network demonstrates how individual cruelty can become institutionalized through carefully constructed systems of mutual benefit and enforced silence. Chapter 5. The Children. A generation born into inventory. The most heartbreaking documents discovered in the Whitmore Plantation's hidden archives are the birth records that track children not as human beings, but as production outcomes in a systematic breeding program. These records, maintained with the same clinical precision used for livestock, reveal how enslaved children born into the breeding program existed in a parallel world where their value was determined by genetic traits rather than their humanity. Dr. Whitmore's ledgers assign each child born in the breeding program a numerical designation and tracking code that followed them throughout their lives. WM 1847-12 refers to the 12th child born in 1847, with detailed notes on parentage, physical characteristics, and projected commercial value. These children were never given traditional names in the official records. They existed as numbered assets in a business that treated human reproduction as manufacturing. The genetic tracking system reveals the systematic nature of the breeding program's approach to children. Dr. Whitmore maintained detailed charts showing bloodlines, genetic crosses, and the outcomes of specific breeding combinations. Children were classified by categories such as field stock, house service potential, or breeding continuation, with their futures determined before they could walk. The records show that children designated for breeding continuation were never sold outside the network, instead being transferred between cooperating plantations to maintain genetic diversity in the program. But the records also reveal something Dr. Whitmore clearly didn't anticipate: the bonds between mothers and children that persisted despite the systematic attempts to reduce both to commercial commodities. Several entries describe complications arising from maternal attachment, with mothers refusing to allow their children to be examined or transferred. Dr. Whitmore's notes show increasing frustration with what he called primitive emotional responses that interfered with efficient program operations. The children's living conditions were dictated entirely by their commercial potential. Those designated as premium stock received better nutrition and medical care to maintain their value, while others were housed in conditions that barely supported survival. The medical records show that childhood mortality rates in the breeding program were nearly twice the already horrific rates typical of plantation slavery, with deaths often resulting from experimental medical procedures designed to enhance desirable traits. As children in the breeding program reached adolescence, they faced systematic evaluation that determined their adult roles. The records describe physical examinations that assessed not just health and strength, but reproductive potential and genetic suitability. These evaluations, conducted with the clinical detachment of livestock inspection, determined whether children would be sold to buyers seeking labor, retained for continued breeding, or transferred to other facilities in the network. The educational records reveal another dimension of the program's cruelty. Children who showed intellectual promise were subjected to rudimentary education, not for their own development, but to increase their commercial value. Dr. Whitmore's notes describe teaching selected children to read and perform basic calculations specifically because educated stock commands premium prices in specialized markets. Even learning became another form of exploitation. Archaeological evidence from the plantation grounds has revealed the remains of children who didn't survive the breeding program's experimental procedures. Burial sites located far from the official plantation cemetery contain the remains of children whose deaths were never recorded in any official documents. The evidence suggests that these deaths resulted from medical experiments designed to enhance genetic traits or prevent inherited conditions that might reduce commercial value. The psychological impact of the breeding program on children is documented in Dr. Whitmore's increasingly frustrated notes about behavioral problems among adolescents in the program. His records describe resistance, escape attempts, and what he termed psychological instability among teenagers who had grown up knowing they existed solely as commercial products. Several entries describe the need for increased security and punishment to maintain control over young people who refused to accept their designated roles. The correspondence with buyers reveals the market demand that drove the systematic abuse of these children. Letters requesting specific combinations of age, physical traits, and abilities demonstrate how completely children in the breeding program were reduced to commodities. One particularly disturbing letter from a Mississippi plantation owner requests breeding pairs, male and female, ages 14-16, with documented genetic compatibility and no inherited defects, for immediate integration into established program. The children born into the Whitmore breeding program represent a generation deliberately created as inventory, their humanity systematically erased by adults who saw them only as products in a commercial enterprise that treated human reproduction as manufacturing. Chapter 6. The Evidence They Tried to Destroy. If this story has already gripped you, leave a like. It helps Character Family Name's story reach more people. The discovery of the Whitmore Plantation's hidden archives represents just a fraction of the evidence that once documented the systematic breeding program. The records themselves reveal a deliberate campaign to destroy documentation that began even before the Civil War ended and continued for decades afterward, as participants in the network scrambled to eliminate proof of their crimes. What survived in the plantation's hidden chambers did so only because of architectural secrets that the destroyers never discovered. The evidence suggests that the destruction began in earnest during the winter of 1864, as Union forces advanced through Florida, and the participants in the breeding network realized that federal investigations might uncover their operations. Dr. Whitmore's final entries describe necessary document management procedures and archive consolidation efforts, euphemisms for the systematic burning of records that might implicate the network's participants. But the destruction wasn't random or panicked. The surviving correspondence reveals that network participants coordinated their evidence destruction efforts, sharing information about which types of documents were most dangerous and which records could be safely altered rather than destroyed. Judge Caldwell's legal expertise proved crucial in this phase, as he advised other participants on which documents had legal significance that would be missed if they disappeared entirely. Bank records from the period show large payments to individuals identified only by code names for archive management services. These payments, traced through multiple financial institutions, suggest that the network employed professional document destroyers who specialized in eliminating evidence of criminal enterprises. The amounts involved indicate that this was a sophisticated operation rather than simple document burning. The architectural evidence from the Whitmore Plantation reveals the lengths to which participants went to hide evidence even as they were creating it. The hidden chambers weren't discovered during the initial destruction efforts because they were concealed behind false walls that appeared to be structural elements of the building. Dr. Whitmore had apparently anticipated the need to hide evidence and built concealment systems into the plantation's original construction. But some evidence survived in unexpected places. During the restoration work, researchers discovered that Dr. Whitmore had hidden duplicate records in the foundations of outbuildings, sealed in waterproof containers that weren't discovered until ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalies in the building foundations. These duplicate records provided verification for the main archives and revealed that the destruction efforts had eliminated approximately 80% of the original documentation. The pattern of destruction extended beyond the Whitmore Plantation to other sites in the network. Archaeological investigations at related plantations have found evidence of large-scale burning in the final years of the Civil War, with ash deposits containing fragments of paper and metal that suggest systematic document destruction. Chemical analysis of these ash deposits has revealed traces of ink and parchment consistent with the types of records found intact at the Whitmore site. Local newspaper archives from the Reconstruction period contain references to mysterious fires at plantation sites across north-central Florida, often involving buildings that had served as record-keeping centers. These fires were typically attributed to electrical problems or structural failures, but the pattern suggests coordinated destruction efforts designed to eliminate evidence of the breeding network's operations. The legal records from the immediate post-war period show another dimension of the cover-up effort. Judge Caldwell used his position to ensure that probate proceedings and estate settlements for deceased network participants were handled in ways that eliminated problematic documents. Court records show that estate inventories for several plantation owners list generic agricultural records that were subsequently destroyed due to deterioration, rather than being preserved as historical documents. Even the destruction efforts left clues about the network's true scope. Financial records from the 1870s show continued payments between former network participants, suggesting ongoing efforts to maintain silence and eliminate evidence that might have survived the initial destruction. These payments continued well into the 1880s, indicating that the cover-up was a long-term collaborative effort. The correspondence reveals that participants in the breeding network were acutely aware that their crimes would be judged harshly, even by the standards of their time. Dr. Whitmore's letters express concern about historical interpretations and reputation management that suggest he understood the lasting damage that exposure of the breeding program would cause to his family's standing. The evidence they tried to destroy represents not just documentation of individual crimes, but proof of a systematic conspiracy that involved respected community leaders, elected officials, and professional men who used their positions of trust to facilitate and profit from the systematic rape and trafficking of enslaved women and children. Chapter 7. Voices from the Grave: What the Bones Tell Us. Archaeological excavations at the Whitmore Plantation have revealed burial sites that don't appear in any official records, containing remains that tell the story of the breeding program's victims in ways that no written document could convey. The forensic analysis of these remains provides scientific confirmation of the systematic abuse documented in the hidden archives, while revealing the human cost of crimes that their perpetrators believed they had hidden forever. Ground-penetrating radar identified 17 burial sites scattered across remote areas of the plantation property, far from the official slave cemetery that appears on historical maps and property records. These hidden graves contain the remains of approximately 60 individuals, mostly women and children, whose deaths were never recorded in any official documentation. The burial practices and grave goods suggest these people were important to the enslaved community, despite being erased from written records. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Sarah Martinez led the excavation team that began exhuming these remains in late 2023. Her preliminary analysis reveals patterns of trauma and medical intervention that provide physical evidence of the breeding program's systematic cruelty. Many of the female remains show evidence of repeated pregnancies, surgical procedures, and injuries consistent with forced medical examinations. The bone analysis reveals nutritional deficiencies and disease patterns that suggest these women received inadequate medical care despite being valuable breeding assets. The children's remains tell an even more disturbing story. Several small skeletons show evidence of experimental surgical procedures, with cut marks and bone modifications that suggest medical interventions designed to enhance or alter physical development. Dr. Martinez's analysis indicates that some children died from procedures that had no legitimate medical purpose, appearing to be experimental attempts to manipulate genetic traits or physical characteristics. But the graves also reveal acts of love and resistance that the breeding program couldn't eliminate. Many burials include personal items and grave goods that would have required other enslaved people to risk punishment by providing them. Small pieces of jewelry, carved wooden objects, and textile fragments suggest that these victims maintained their humanity and connections to their community, despite the systematic attempts to reduce them to commercial commodities. The isotope analysis of the remains provides evidence of the breeding network's regional scope. Chemical signatures in the bones indicate that many individuals buried at the Whitmore site had spent time at other locations, consistent with the correspondence showing transfers between network plantations. Several individuals show isotope patterns, suggesting they had lived in Virginia, Georgia, and South Carolina before arriving at the Florida facility. DNA analysis of the remains has revealed family relationships that weren't documented in any written records. Several burial sites contain mothers and children who died together, suggesting that family bonds persisted despite the breeding program's attempts to treat people as individual commercial assets. The genetic analysis also reveals evidence of inbreeding that confirms the systematic nature of the breeding program and its focus on controlling reproduction rather than human welfare. The positioning and orientation of the graves provides insight into the beliefs and practices of the enslaved community that survived the breeding program. Despite the secrecy required to bury victims of the program, the graves follow traditional African burial practices, with bodies oriented toward ancestral homelands and arranged in family groups when possible. These burial practices represent acts of cultural preservation and resistance that persisted despite the systematic attempts to destroy enslaved people's connections to their heritage. The forensic analysis has also revealed evidence of violent death among some victims. Several skulls show fractures consistent with blunt force trauma, while other remains display cut marks that suggest knife wounds. Dr. Martinez's preliminary assessment indicates that some victims of the breeding program were murdered when they became too resistant or when their continued existence threatened the program's secrecy. The age distribution of the remains confirms the breeding program's focus on women of reproductive age and their children. Most adult remains are female, aged between 15 and 35, while child remains range from newborn to adolescent. The absence of elderly remains suggests that individuals who survived beyond their reproductive usefulness were transferred elsewhere or eliminated to reduce the number of witnesses who could testify about the program's operations. The preservation of organic materials in several graves has provided evidence of the clothing and personal possessions that victims were buried with. Textile analysis reveals that many individuals were buried in clothing that was better quality than typical slave attire, suggesting that other enslaved people made special efforts to honor these victims despite the risks involved. These burial clothes represent final acts of dignity and love in circumstances designed to eliminate all human connection and compassion. The bones speak a truth that no amount of document destruction could silence, providing physical evidence of systematic crimes that their perpetrators believed they had hidden forever beneath Florida soil. Chapter 8. The Descendants Who Carried the Secret. The story of the Whitmore breeding program didn't end with the Civil War or even with the destruction of most documentation. Instead, it continued as a closely guarded family secret passed down through generations of descendants who struggled with the knowledge of their ancestors' crimes while benefiting from the wealth those crimes had generated. The restoration work at the plantation uncovered not just historical evidence, but a web of complicity and silence that extended well into the 20th century. Letters discovered in the estate papers of Dr. Whitmore's son, Marcus Whitmore, Jr., reveal that knowledge of the breeding program was deliberately preserved within the family, even as all public evidence was being destroyed. Marcus Jr.'s correspondence with his own sons shows that he viewed this knowledge as both a burden and a responsibility, writing that the true nature of our family's prosperity must be understood by each generation, lest we repeat the errors that secured our position. But understanding didn't lead to acknowledgement or atonement. Instead, the Whitmore family used their knowledge of the breeding network to identify and eliminate any remaining evidence that might surface over the decades. Financial records from the early 1900s show regular payments to private investigators and local officials who were tasked with monitoring for any discoveries that might threaten the family's reputation. These payments continued until the 1950s, indicating a multi-generational commitment to maintaining the cover-up. The Whitmore family's wealth, built on the profits of systematic human trafficking and forced breeding, allowed them to become prominent philanthropists and civic leaders in 20th century Florida. Schools, libraries, and hospitals bearing the Whitmore name were funded by money that originated from the breeding program, creating a legacy of respected public service that obscured the criminal origins of the family fortune. This transformation from slave breeders to community pillars represents one of the most successful reputation rehabilitations in American history, but other families connected to the breeding network chose different approaches to their inherited guilt. The descendants of Judge Caldwell maintained detailed private archives documenting their ancestors' involvement in the breeding program, apparently as a form of historical penance. These archives, discovered when the family estate was sold in 2019, contained copies of legal documents and correspondence that provided crucial verification for the evidence found at the Whitmore Plantation. The family papers reveal that some descendants struggled with profound guilt over their ancestors' crimes. Letters from the 1920s and 1930s show several Caldwell family members attempted to research the fates of people who had been victims of the breeding program, hoping to provide some form of compensation or acknowledgement. But their efforts were consistently blocked by other network families who viewed any investigation as a threat to their carefully constructed, respectable reputations. The network families' influence extended beyond their own reputations to broader historical narratives about slavery in Florida. Several prominent historians and academic institutions received substantial donations from network families during the mid-20th century, coinciding with the publication of historical works that portrayed Florida slavery as more benign than the brutal reality documented in the hidden archives. This academic influence helped ensure that the systematic breeding programs remained absent from scholarly research and public understanding. But maintaining silence required constant vigilance and occasional ruthless action. The family correspondence reveals several instances where potential witnesses or researchers who came too close to uncovering the truth faced economic pressure, legal threats, or professional sabotage that forced them to abandon their investigations. One particularly detailed file describes the systematic destruction of a graduate student's research career after she began investigating unusual patterns in antebellum Florida plantation records. The psychological cost of maintaining these family secrets emerges clearly in the personal correspondence and diary entries discovered in various family archives. Several descendants describe nightmares, depression, and substance abuse problems that they explicitly connected to their knowledge of their family's crimes. One diary entry from 1967 describes the writer's struggle with the weight of inherited guilt and her fear that divine justice would eventually demand payment for crimes that had gone unpunished for over a century. The most revealing documents are the private agreements between network families that establish protocols for sharing information and coordinating responses to potential threats to their shared secret. These agreements, updated and renewed regularly throughout the 20th century, created a mutual protection society that pooled resources to eliminate evidence and silence potential witnesses. The financial commitments involved in these agreements indicate that protecting the secret cost the family's millions of dollars over multiple generations. As the last generation with direct family knowledge of the breeding program began to die in the 1980s and 1990s, some descendants made different choices about their inherited burden. Several families quietly donated large sums to historically black colleges and civil rights organizations, apparently as a form of anonymous atonement for their ancestors' crimes. But these donations came with strict requirements that they never be traced back to the donor families, ensuring that even their guilt remained secret. The discovery of the Whitmore archives has shattered the carefully maintained silence that protected these families for over 150 years, forcing their descendants to confront a legacy they had hoped would remain buried forever. Chapter 9. When the past refuses to stay buried. The restoration work that began at the Whitmore Plantation in March 2023 was supposed to create a heritage tourism site celebrating Florida's antebellum history. Instead, it became a criminal investigation that exposed one of the most systematic programs of human trafficking and sexual exploitation in American history. As the evidence mounted and the full scope of the breeding network became clear, law enforcement agencies, historians, and descendant communities faced the challenge of how to address crimes that had been hidden for over 170 years. The FBI opened a federal investigation in September 2023 after preliminary analysis of the hidden archives revealed evidence of a multi-state conspiracy involving systematic human trafficking. While the perpetrators were long dead, federal prosecutors determined that the network's operations violated numerous federal laws that had no statute of limitations for crimes involving systematic human trafficking and sexual exploitation. The investigation focused on tracing assets and property that could be tied to profits from the breeding program. But the legal investigation revealed a complex web of legitimate businesses, real estate holdings, and financial assets that had been built on the profits of systematic human trafficking. Major corporations, educational institutions, and philanthropic foundations traced their origins to investments made with money that came directly from the breeding network. The scope of the financial investigation expanded as forensic accountants discovered that the network's profits had been systematically laundered through legitimate business investments that continued to generate wealth for descendant families. The academic response to the discoveries at Whitmore Plantation forced a fundamental reassessment of historical understanding about slavery in Florida and the broader South. The evidence of systematic breeding programs operating with scientific methodology and regional coordination contradicted decades of scholarship that had portrayed plantation slavery as primarily focused on agricultural labor. Major universities launched research initiatives to investigate whether similar programs had operated at other plantation sites. The descendant community response revealed the lasting trauma of crimes that had never been acknowledged or addressed. DNA analysis of remains found at the plantation site enabled genealogists to identify living descendants of breeding program victims, many of whom had grown up with family stories about ancestors who had disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances. For these families, the Whitmore discoveries provided answers to questions that had persisted for generations, but also confirmed their worst fears about their ancestors' suffering. The tourism industry faced an unprecedented challenge in deciding how to present a site where systematic sexual exploitation and human trafficking had occurred for over a decade. Traditional heritage tourism approaches that focused on architectural beauty and romanticized plantation life were clearly inappropriate for a site where the primary historical significance was systematic human rights violations. The Florida Historical Preservation Society ultimately decided that the Whitmore Plantation would become an educational site focused on the realities of slavery rather than a traditional tourist attraction. But the most significant impact of the Whitmore discoveries was the revelation that systematic programs of forced breeding had operated across the South with the knowledge and protection of legal, medical, and political authorities. The evidence suggested that the Whitmore network was just one example of similar operations that had systematically treated enslaved people as breeding stock, while maintaining the appearance of conventional agricultural enterprises. The search for similar sites expanded across the former Confederate states as researchers used the Whitmore documents to identify other plantations that had operated with suspicious secrecy and unusual financial arrangements. Ground-penetrating radar surveys at dozens of plantation sites revealed evidence of hidden chambers, secret burial grounds, and architectural modifications that suggested similar operations had been much more widespread than anyone had previously suspected. The legal settlements reached with descendant families of network participants established precedents for addressing historical crimes that had generated ongoing economic benefits for perpetrator families. Several major family estates agreed to substantial payments to educational and community development programs serving African American communities, while maintaining that these settlements were not admissions of legal liability for their ancestors' crimes. The international response to the Whitmore discoveries highlighted the global dimensions of systematic human trafficking and breeding programs that had operated throughout the Americas during the slavery period. UNESCO launched an investigation into similar sites in other countries, where plantation slavery had involved systematic breeding programs, revealing that the Whitmore network was part of a hemisphere-wide system of human trafficking that had operated with scientific methodology and international coordination. As 2024 ended, the full scope of the Whitmore breeding network remained under investigation, with new evidence continuing to emerge as families opened private archives and researchers gained access to previously sealed historical documents. The plantation that was supposed to celebrate Florida's heritage had instead revealed that the heritage was far darker and more systematic than anyone had imagined. The Whitmore plantation stands today not as a monument to antebellum elegance, but as a testament to the truth that no amount of time, money, or influence can keep buried forever. The voices that were silenced for 170 years have finally found their audience, and their testimony ensures that the crimes committed against them will never be forgotten again. Subscribe to the channel to learn about more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the Whitmore plantation. See you in the next video.